The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Hope everybody's having a great end of the summer. Looking forward to fall. I know I am. I'm enjoying the cooler weather. This morning I wanted to get up pretty early and record a few different podcasts, some quick kind of brief podcasts. And the first one is going to be a look at the podcast we put out about 10 days ago called the Ketamine Response. And this ketamine response was due to an article that was released out of the Annals of Emergency Medicine. It was called Hemodynamic Response After Rapid Sequence Intubation with Ketamine in Out-of-Hospital Patients at Risk of Shock as Defined by the Shock Index. And again, you can find that article in the show notes. Remember, if you don't know where the show notes are, you have to physically go to FlightBridgeED.com and go to the podcast link at the top of the banner, and you'll find this latest podcast. Just click on that podcast, open it up, and you'll see this PDF at the bottom underneath the actual podcast artwork. If you remember, it hasn't been very long ago, again, about 10 days ago, we looked at this from the perspective of, does ketamine cause a drop in blood pressure, right? In this article, I've actually been sent this article by other colleagues in my primary work with air methods. And, this is kind of a big thing. And I think, again, if you haven't listened to this, please go listen to this, because it's real easy to just look at an article, look at a title, and then get a little bit overwhelmed by something or take a knee-jerk reaction. And so this is something that's been on my mind, and I brought this up to one of our medical directors and our scientific advisor, and he's very well known around the world as far as airway research, and just an amazing doctor, Dr. Dan Davis. And we were talking about this article over lunch, and I had a few questions. I really, when I was calculating the shock index, right, this whole article was based on a shock index. I was calculating the different blood pressures, the systolics, and I was dividing that systolic into a pulse rate, and I was getting different numbers. And if you remember, any shock index greater than 0.9 is supposed to be a bad thing, right? And that's a predictor of morbidity, mortality, and trauma. And so I just wanted to do a follow-up podcast and kind of just touch on this, maybe take a few more minutes on the topic and read a few different articles. There are articles out there that have looked at this from that perspective. One in particular was put out. It's called A Pre-Hospital Shock Index for Trauma Correlates with Measures of Hospital Resource Use and Mortality. And basically the conclusion was a pre-hospital shock index for trauma correlates with measures of hospital resource use and mortality. A prospective study is needed to determine the use of this measure as a triage tool. The results showed, after looking at 16,269 patients, that when you look at a shock index, and if that shock index is greater than 0.9, it indicates a very high likelihood of this patient going to the intensive care, going to the operating room, or overall death. There are multiple papers out there. I'll try to find a few more to put into the show notes. But I just really quickly wanted to kind of look at a few different blood pressures. And I don't have the answers to some of the questions I have that I'll kind of bring up, and I would love to get your emails and your kind of commentary, or go to the FlightBridgeED.com community page and kind of put your thoughts in there. But if we kind of look at different perspectives, different blood pressures, and we start with 100 over 60, so systolic of 100, diastolic over 60, and the patient's got a pulse rate of 80. That shock index, if we divide 100 into 80, is 0.8. Remember, we want a shock index below 0.9. If we take that same patient and they have a systolic of 100 and their heart rate goes up to 100, well, then we have a shock index of 1.0. So I think it's really interesting, and you'll see kind of the trend. If we take that same patient and we have a shock index, or I should say a systolic blood pressure of 100, and we divide that into a pulse rate of 60. So now they're a little bit bradycardic, or maybe they haven't responded to an illness, or this could be just a norm for them. Their shock index goes to 0.6. So that was kind of my question to Dr. Dan Davis, and we kind of discussed this, and he agreed that there are aspects to the shock index that don't really make sense. But from what I kind of take from calculating all these different shock indexes, if you have a patient that is tachycardic, that is an ominous thing. We know that patients maybe don't compensate based on medications. They may not compensate based on a lot of things, or they may be in a situation, an illness that they're already decompensated significantly and their heart rate is really, really low. But we also know that, and we have seen this trend in AMLS and in trauma. In trauma, if you just have a tachycardic rhythm, a normal blood pressure, and that tachycardic rhythm is greater than 120, that is decompensated shock. If you look at a medical patient and that medical patient has a tachycardic rate of greater than 130, that patient is in decompensated shock. So any patient, whether their blood pressure is normal or hypotensive, if they have a tachycardic rhythm, tachycardic rate, I should say, that is not a good thing. If we look at another set of blood pressures and pulse rates, and we have an 80/50 with a heart rate of 100, that shock index is 1.25. So remember, we need anything greater than 0.9 is indicative of a ominous patient. If we look at that same patient and we have a shock index, or I should say a systolic blood pressure of 80/52, and now we have a tachycardic rate that's greater than 120, so we'll say 130 for this patient, your shock index shoots up to 1.6. You take that same patient, though, and you make him bradycardic, and the shock index goes down to 0.77. So basically a blood pressure of 80/52, we have a heart rate of 62, and their shock index drops below 0.9. And so I guess that's my one question is, you have a patient that is bradycardic and they're hypotensive like that. You would think, just based on everything we've been taught, and frankly, anything I've seen in medicine, that patient scares me, right? Any patient that is bradycardic with a blood pressure low like that, that's not a good thing. So I don't really have the answer to that, and Dan Davis didn't have the answer to that either. If you look at a blood pressure of 88/46 with a heart rate of 150, that's a shock index of 1.7, so very, very high. And for that matter, if you look at a patient that has a pretty normal blood pressure, 120/80, and they're also tachycardic at 150, that shock index is 1.25. So you can see, based on the different formulas, different calculations on these blood pressures and these pulse rates, that just the tachycardia associated with really any blood pressure, that's going to be a kind of telltale sign that your shock index is probably greater than 0.9. Again, I really, really hope you listen to the last podcast, kind of read that article, read the study, look at the corresponding data as far as what medications they use for pre-induction. And just remember that no matter what we give, there are some patients with their shock index being greater than 0.9. Whether we give ketamine, whether we give other medications, they're going to have a decompensation, right? That is inevitable. That's going to happen. And really, one of the telltale things that Dr. Dan Davis had told me, that really any patient with a systolic blood pressure less than 80 has a high chance of arresting in trauma, really within 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, that may be even a little long. So always consider those things, and again, go back to resuscitation. Resuscitate these patients first, give them volume, start some blood, manage their airway with BLS procedures until you can get some fluid on board, and then give them the medications to RSI them. Again, I hope you enjoy this quick little podcast, this quick little overview on Chalk Index, and try to apply this in your practice. Again, let me know your thoughts, any different ideas, and until next time, I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.